Hi, and welcome to the Start Here podcast for Ruby on Rails. My name is Dane Miller, and I'm here to teach you how to become a Ruby on Rails developer. You can find us online at starthere.fm. Hey guys, and welcome to the second episode of Start Here Ruby on Rails. In the first episode, you'll remember that we touched on everything that you need to know when you're initially getting ready to dive into Ruby on Rails development and self-education specifically. We looked at the differences between going to a boot camp and learning on your own, and we weighed the pros and cons of both. And we also provided sort of a framework and a toolbox for you to approach a new industry and sort of gain context and understanding. So if you really want to understand those concepts more, I would suggest going back and listening to episode 1. In this episode, what we're going to touch on is more of the current state of the world. So when you're trying to teach yourself something new, especially a programming language or a framework or something that you're eventually going to become what you would hope to be an expert in, you need to be aware of the current state of things as you're learning techniques and tools regarding that framework or that programming language or that tool set, right? So that's an important part of gaining context, which we talked about in the last episode. But as you're going about this learning process, continuing to understand the current state of the world will allow you to actually learn quicker, I think. Because what you'll be able to do is, let's say you're watching or learning or reading something that's a little bit out of date. Perhaps you notice, because you're very aware of the current state of things, that you actually don't have to learn that. So you can actually make these maneuvers on your path to learning by understanding the current state and like where we're heading in the next 3 months really clearly. And that's what we want to provide in this episode. This is just sort of a supplemental episode. So you can think of these as going off and on. We'll have one more of an educational type episode, and then we'll have one more supplemental episode the next week regarding sort of the current state of things. And this is a great week to have it because we just had Railsconf and Rails 5 was just announced. So there's plenty of interesting things to talk about and discuss, and we'll jump into those next. So the first thing that's interesting to talk about is Railsconf. Railsconf happens every year. This year it happened on April 21st, April 22nd, and April 23rd, and it had a ton of great speakers. They have full days of multiple sets, multiple areas where people can speak, and multiple tracks of speaking, so you can actually pick what type of topic you want to learn about. And the introductory keynote, the opening keynote, was given by David Heinemeier Hansson, fittingly, and it was on the first day at 9:30 a.m. And that was where he announced to the public Rails 5. And if you're following Rails development on GitHub, you would have definitely noticed and seen these things previously. So this isn't like super shocking news or anything, but we're just going to touch on a little bit of what he announced and what would be included in Rails 5 moving forward. And I'll break down each of the big items so that you have more context and awareness over what they are, why should people care, and why should people even utilize them when time comes, or if people will. But before I do that, I just want to give a little history on Railsconf in general. So Railsconf is brought to us by the team at Ruby Central, which is a really cool group of guys. They've been doing this conference since 2006, and it's actually the largest gathering of Rails developers in the world. That's what they tout it as, and I wouldn't decline that from being true. It seems accurate at this point. And every single year, it's sort of this place where David Heinemeier Hansson, the creator of Ruby on Rails, goes to kind of prophesize about Rails or discuss what he thinks is happening in the industry. And oftentimes he'll announce the latest version of Rails sort of at this conference. It's interesting how it's evolved over the years. It's almost like there's this Apple-esque following of people that are really interested in watching the keynote and seeing what's going to be in the new version of Rails, similarly to how people would watch like an iPad or an iPhone keynote to see what's going to be in the next iPhone. So it's not quite that level of intensity, but it's similar. There's definitely like this following that's gathering around these conferences, and especially Railsconf with regard to when new Rails versions are going to be released, especially, which is interesting. So, in a couple of years, we'll see another one of these. Maybe next year, there'll be something else to announce, but at this point, I think it's just best to sort of dive right into what was announced at the keynote I'm talking about and sort of why it matters. So Rails 5 will contain a few items that are very different from each other. And there's a lot that's going into it. And there's a lot of collaborators and a lot of people. And you can explore that on GitHub. I'll have links to sort of all the GitHub resources for the Rails repository organization, the pull requests and issues and all of that. You could browse if you want. But right now, what you need to know about Rails 5 is it will have three major things. It will have Turbolinks 3.0. It will have something called ActionCable. And it will have a section called Rails API. Well, it's not a section. It will have a feature called Rails API. And those are the three main areas that we're going to cover here. And each of those are fairly interesting. There's a large amount of people that don't like certain aspects of some of these. So for instance, there used to be quite a lot of pushback against Turbolinks, and we'll talk about what Turbolinks is next and really dive into why there's controversy there and how it works in general. So Rails 5, Turbolinks, this is the first feature we're going to talk about tonight. So Turbolinks 3.0 is going to be in Rails 5. So what is Turbolinks? Why does this matter? So nowadays in the web world, it's pretty well known these days that you'll have some sort of JavaScript framework that does a lot of the UI, UX integrations. So what that means is you'll see a lot of these JavaScript thick client frameworks that people use, and it's pretty well assumed that you will probably use one of these on your project. So it's like a Backbone JS, an Angular JS, an Ember JS, and there's many more, right? And the point of these frameworks is that they do allow for this very fluid page transition. Doing all of this in JavaScript has a lot of benefits, and it makes these applications feel very native. They feel really great when you're using them. They feel really fast and snappy, and the animations can look great, and the page transitions can even be animated. And, obviously we don't want to go overboard with animations, so I'm just zoning in on that as an example. There's a lot of examples as to why it's great. So what is Turbolinks in reference to that single page application framework ecosystem that's developed? So Turbolinks is something that's trying to do all of that for you automatically. All of those same benefits you would get from a single page application, Turbolinks tries to say, just install a gem and I can give you those benefits. The quick page reloading, the not having to reload the CSS, etc., the other assets, that's very beneficial. And what it would do is Turbolinks worked by simply grabbing a DOM element like the body tag or some other DOM element, and it would basically replace the page contents. It would inject the new HTML into the div or the body tag that was chosen. So what that did is it allowed us to send these really quick updates back and forth from the server and back to the client. And the updates might not actually be faster than previously. It's just that you're utilizing this like injection type of interaction between the server and the client, this injection contract. And by doing that, you gain all these benefits that a single page application framework would really provide you. And there was a little bit of pushback against this when this initially came out, and there's still been a large swath of people that are sort of the opinion like, why are we working on this? Why is this a priority? Why can't we just utilize these other frameworks? There's just two different schools of thought here, right? Like there's the school of thought that a lot of this we can do automatically. And then there's the school of thought like, well, put that automation into those frameworks and then integrate those frameworks back into Rails such that we can sort of build those ecosystems as well to create these more richer type of web experiences, because we're building this rich experience on the web JavaScript development side, right? Like, whereas here we're trying to build some automation in the Rails side, and a lot of people have this disconnect with that. They don't think that's the right idea, and I'm not sure exactly where I stand. Honestly, I haven't used Turbolinks a lot because all of the applications that I built have either been not SPA or the SPA apps have been sufficiently complicated to where I just went ahead and used Backbone, honestly. And you have things like Angular 2.0, which is coming out, and there's been a whole lot of sort of pushback against that and the rewrites that have been going on there, which is another one of these JavaScript frameworks. So you have this sort of turbulation in the community around SPA right now. And what's interesting about that is it seems as though that is something I would have predicted, right? This is something we could all have expected was going to happen because SPA is so powerful. It's so important to our community and to web development in general that there's a whole lot of turbulation around sort of what to do. Like it's okay that that's happening because it's so important that that's why it's happening, right? Like it's the same thing in any sort of industry. If a lot of people get involved and really into something, there's a huge swath of innovation that goes on, and then maybe at the end of the innovation period there's like this decline or like this plateau period, and then there's a more of an innovation type period again in some different type of angle or way. And I think we're just in, potentially the latter phase of one of those innovation periods, about to head into a different type of implementation paradigm here. I think the whole concept of SPA is about to get even more intense, and that's what I'm talking about there. I think, we're going to start using things like WebSockets a lot more. We're going to start really focusing on why would you ever build an application without SPA? And that's going to change a lot of, and then you have ECMAScript 6 that's going to be dropping, hopefully, and you have JavaScript sort of coming into maturity. All of these things going, all these factors in the ecosystem are sort of converging into this time where right now it can be a lot to understand or deal with in the JavaScript ecosystem, and especially with regard to SPA, and many people don't even understand what to learn or what to do next or what direction to go. So, I mean, Rails just picked a direction, right? Rails was like, we're going to help some people by just doing what we can automatically. So some people don't have to learn it. That's valid. I think one person has to be doing that, and that's Rails. So totally cool. And at the end of this podcast, we'll actually talk about some other frameworks in the Ruby community that are starting to get some traction. And there's a lot going on right now in as far as like the community itself. So it's okay that I think Rails is doing this. I'm probably not going to use Turbolinks a lot, but who knows? Maybe if Turbolinks became like really, really great, then maybe we would all use it. And there's no saying that it couldn't, because the team is absolutely brilliant beyond all measure, world-class team on the Rails core. So I wouldn't doubt them in any way. And that actually gets into what Turbolinks 3.0 is. That was what was introduced at Railsconf this year. Rails 5 will have Turbolinks 3.0. And what is this next update? Is this update good enough to make us all not use Backbone or Angular? What is this? So Turbolinks 3 is basically allowing you to do partial updating. That's the whole idea. And Turbolinks previous to this was, like I said before, it was mass updating of the entire DOM, right? So it was like this steamroller-esque solution. And that's why a lot of people didn't like it. So now, theoretically, people should like it more, because now you can actually define, using data attributes, which DOM elements you want to update. So for instance, let's say you have a comment section below your blog post, just to be super trivial, and you want to update that comment section without actually replacing all of the HTML for the blog post as well. You can now do that using data tags and sort of things like render calls on the server side. We'll be aware of that, and you can actually assign it to update that one specific item. And is partial updating enough to really move everybody over into using that for SPA? I'm not sure that that's enough. I think it's the right direction to go. I mean, obviously, it's like this is normal for Rails to try to implement next. I think going from an entire page injection type scenario to a more specific updating type scenario, that seems reasonable. And I think we're even going to go further down this road in the next couple months, in the next year. I think we're going to get to the point where with Rails, you can actually use data attributes to pretty much do everything that Backbone JS or an Angular JS would give you with data bindings and such. I'm not sure the data binding stuff will be there, but a lot of the server to client stuff will. So for instance, having something where you can add a data attribute to like multiple different items to do iteration on the JavaScript side, but not actually rendering that on the server. I would expect their caching sort of like interface to get much more intelligent with regard to this scenario here. So when you have this like JavaScript rendering situation, you can much more aggressively cache, but you also have to be much more aggressive about cache invalidation and invalidating that cache. So I would expect in the next couple of months, there's going to be a lot more sort of intelligent thinking around the cache, and perhaps there already has been. I haven't really perused that section of the GitHub too thoroughly, but that would be something that I think is a necessary, right? So you have the caching totally integrated with the Turbolinks 3.0, and then in Turbolinks 4.0, maybe you have much more aggressive types of settings. Maybe you have more things that you can define and actually specify as far as like data attributes that get updated in certain ways. There could be a lot that goes on there, and there's obviously a ton of different implementation paradigms that they could introduce. Will they include a JavaScript type framework in the front end so that you can do things like data binding, two-way data binding? I'm not sure if they'll ever do that. I'm not sure if they'll also include some kind of big JavaScript library where you can also do two-way data binding that works really, really well. Maybe they are already planning to do that and I'm totally wrong, but it doesn't seem like something that we should expect. And in fact, I've worked on a lot of projects where the two-way data binding is not as cool as you would think. I mean, it's not really super necessary. So in the future, I would expect a lot of edit pages and show pages to be the same thing. This whole concept of like editing something and it looking different than when you display it is sort of a faulty concept. It's a construct that we're trying to shed ourselves from. And if you're building your next application, I would really recommend trying to figure out how the show page can just be the edit page. You don't need to sort of go to some kind of input boxes or whatnot. I mean, there's certain instances where you do, and there's certain instances where you then can kind of pop down a modal or something that's a really great editing experience. And then sometimes two-way data binding is okay because then you can see kind of like what it looks like as you're doing it. But anyway, what I'm getting at is the better solution to two-way data binding is just literally editing in place. That is the ideal solution. If you saw the latest Squarespace update, the Squarespace 6.0, I think it was, or 8.0, one of the two, and what it was basically they removed the entire backend editor. So you're editing the page live. And I really do think in the future, that's sort of how we'll think about things. And I think if you start doing that now, you'll be in a great spot for the future. And as far as Rails doing anything else, that's all I have to say about Turbolinks. I think it's interesting. I will check it out. And I've used Turbolinks before in the past. I wouldn't recommend investing yourself mentally too much into it. I would read a few articles. I'll have an article linked at the bottom of the show about it. Then I would just definitely go back to learning if you're learning JavaScript front-end framework like Backbone or Angular, I would say still learn it. Like this isn't a scenario where I would say stop everything you're doing in the JavaScript world if you're doing SPA and focus on this because this is the answer. I'm not sure that's the case. So I would definitely say to continue your education around Backbone or Angular or Ember or whatever sort of framework you're using. And if you're building your own framework, I would still recommend you do that. Like this isn't a scenario where we can go all in on one thing yet. We don't know. At least I don't know. I can't clearly see. So anyway, that's all I have to say about Turbolinks. And on to the second item that was announced in Rails 5, something called ActionCable. Now, this is the second item that was announced in Rails 5 at Railsconf by David Heinemeier Hansen on stage. This is called ActionCable. And what this is it's a new concept. It's actually a new it's going to be a new module, right? It's going to be a whole new class. This name has never been used before in Rails, and that's interesting. It's new development. Before I describe exactly what it is, let's first discuss the state of web applications in general and how they communicate to the server. So in the past, what we've done in the web world is we've used something called Ajax, and that is what is used in all of these single-page application frameworks that we've been discussing up until now on the podcast. Now, how that works is most of those frameworks use something called jQuery, or they proxy their own, but they use an underlying API method called XML HTTP request. And that API is available in web browsers, and it's available in JavaScript. And what it does is it allows you to actually send HTTP and HTTP requests to a web server and then load the data back in the format that you specify. So it can be JSON, XML, etc. Now, what's interesting about this is something that came about in the early 2000s. The spec was actually solidified, but it was something that we've noticed for years and years and years in the 90s and such, and this has been growing. So it's just this concept that you can send a communication item to a server as a client and say, hey, I need this. And then over HTTP or HTTPS, the client then, or the server, my bad, returns the item that you've requested. Now, this is a very standard structure and it works very well. But as we move into the future, having something that is binary in that way of like, I'm going to ask and then you return it, isn't sometimes optimal. Sometimes what you want is the ability for a server to push things, or sometimes you want the ability for the connection to just kind of like stay open, if you can envision that. So instead of it, so think about this, like when you click a button on a website, instead of that button sending an Ajax request to a server to then return a list of items, what if that button opened a connection such that it displayed the list of items, and then let's say another user was in the actual application itself also and was adding items to that list? You could actually see that list of items update in real time because the server would return those new items because the connection is open. So that's the difference here between where we are now and where we're going to this sort of open connection, two-way communication paradigm, and that is the concept behind ActionCable. So ActionCable is essentially the WebSockets implementation into Rails. So basically, WebSockets is exactly what I just mentioned. So this two-way communication, that you can think of that as WebSockets. To be a little bit more formal, WebSockets is a protocol that provides full duplex communication channels over TCP. So this is actually the interesting part, is WebSockets doesn't use HTTP in that regard. The only actual communication it has with HTTP is to do a handshake, and that's interpreted as an upgrade request, which we can get into that later. But it being a TCP-based protocol is really interesting because it allows us to do some of these things, like to keep the connection open and to be able for the server to then push things. So there's a lot of like really cool things that you can do now that you have this two-way communication. And this is something that you probably don't see in a lot of frameworks that you currently use. If you use something like Sales.js for Node that sits on Express, you've seen it. If you use some other Python, I think some Python frameworks are starting to do this, if I'm not mistaken. And there's other frameworks that do it, but it's few and far between at this point. But what you're going to see in the future is that this becomes much more primary. So the concept of keeping this communication window open is becoming more and more important as we grow. So for instance, the ability to see real-time updates on a bidding site so that you're actually bidding and purchasing on the correct price is really important. So for instance, let's say you are on a bidding site, you load the page, and it doesn't have WebSockets or any kind of two-way communication. There's other ways to do it, but for now, let's just pretend two-way communication can only be done by WebSockets. It's not technically the only way you can implement something like this, but let's just pretend that's the case. You load the web page on the bidding site and you see the price. Now let's say somebody else in the world bids on that and the bid goes up. It doesn't go up on your computer, right? Because you didn't refresh the page, you're just sitting there. So when you actually go to click purchase, the programmers have to do a lot of sort of defensive programming. When you click purchase, they have to say, hey, has this price changed since the user saw it on the page? Is this the same price? Like they'll serialize the price down into the server and they'll say, is this the current price? And if not, they'll update the next page. And there's kind of fancy, funny UI tricks that we've done for years and years to get around this problem. Like, for instance, the purchase button going to another page where we show the actual price. And then, I worked on a bidding site and that's exactly what we did. We would show the initial bidding price. And then when they click purchase, there would be a modal that popped up with like the real price, which could have changed within a millisecond because in these penny bidding places, that's how fast things can change. So In any sort of high frequency environment, having this type of two-way communication is entirely beneficial. Imagine not having to do so much of that defensive programming. Imagine not having to think about all of those weird little edge cases. What if you just knew that the website was going to update itself? And what if you knew for a fact that every user that bid was seeing the latest bid, and you would still use transactions on the database so that multiple people didn't update the same thing or break something? But the point is, if you knew that and you had that confidence as a developer, it gives more confidence to the programs that you write, and the software that you build and the UI that you design can be more confident and simple and less complex and less edge case ridden. And solving edge cases through design, at least, is not the best solution. There should be a solution wherein the technology can help alleviate some of those issues, right? And this is the exact scenario where that's taking place. WebSockets can help us alleviate a lot of these issues on websites that feel too static, but yet there's a lot of real-time, high-frequency information going on behind them. And there's a bunch of websites that you can go to see what the sort of WebSocket-like communication is currently. So there's Bitcoin sites that will show you the state of the Bitcoin price and how it fluctuates, and sometimes that's done through WebSockets. What they'll do is they'll keep a connection open as soon as you load the page on port 80 TCP, and it will just send updates every now and then, and you don't have to reload the page, you don't have to do anything. And obviously, you can implement this type of paradigm using something like polling, which is what we did for years and years. We would implement a sort of a polling solution to kind of combat this. So, every 3 seconds or every 1 second or every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, we would hit the server to get the update, right? And that's totally legitimate. That's a great way to go. But in the future, WebSockets are going to be how you do this. And there might be a different name for it. WebSockets is actually a protocol. I mean, there might be some kind of implementation paradigm that we create that makes this easier. I don't know. Maybe ActionCable is it. But anyway, the point is, WebSockets are the future. Doing two-way communication from the server to the client is entirely beneficial with very few negatives. Some, but very few. You can research that on your own. Then I would also say that ActionCable is very interesting in that regard. So how does this tie into Rails, everything we've just been discussing? So Rails is implementing this paradigm. So Rails is implementing a WebSocket-based paradigm, and it's called ActionCable. And here are a few of the high-level details about it that you might need to know. So the first and probably the only thing that we'll need to know really about Rails' specific implementation of ActionCable at this time is that hopefully they combine Turbolinks 3 with ActionCable. So what that means is with Rails itself, you can utilize this two-way communication along with really, really simple DOM updating techniques that don't involve using something like a Backbone JS or an Angular, right? So combining these two things is very beneficial. And this is definitely one of the reasons that DHH announced these two at the same time. That's another reason why these two have been developed at the same time. And it's a great time to sort of talk about these two as a whole, ActionCable and Turbolinks 3. It's just really cool that those two things are happening at the same time. And I think it provides us the glimmer of hope that we might be able to do this. We might be able to pull it off without implementing one of these huge frameworks into these apps. Like, it would be really cool, and I'm all for it. Again, I discussed this in the Turbolinks section, but I mean, I'm all for it. So if this helps add to my benefits of using Rails instead of a backbone with Rails, a Backbone JS with Rails, that is, then I would totally try it out. And that's probably all you need to know about ActionCable itself. WebSockets implementation in Rails. WebSockets is the future of two-way communication on the web, and WebSockets is the future of real-time updating on the web. And Rails' first implementation of it is called ActionCable. Feel free to go get it, play with it, and try it out. And so the last thing that we're going to talk about with regard to Rails 5 is the latter end of the presentation. DHH discussed a little bit about Rails APIs. So this is an interesting topic in and of itself, the concept of building an API. So what is an API? So an API is an application programming interface where you can actually provide data to people that make some sort of standardized request. So let's say you have a bunch of data on a city. You can expose that data on your website. So you can actually, let's say you have 100,000 lines of JSON data. I don't know how you have this. Let's just pretend somebody gave it to you. And it's all about your city that you live, like all the information that somebody could want to know. So you could put it up in your website. So you could say, yourwebsite.com/city information, and that endpoint can just return that JSON, right, in a flat file or something like that. Now, that is theoretically, that's an API. That's a public API. Any of your friends can go to that URL and receive that JSON. And the whole point isn't so much to just receive the JSON. The whole point is to then utilize that in some cool way. So we're seeing a lot of API to API communication these days, and we're seeing a lot of services where building these APIs that interconnect is really powerful. So let's say your state government had such an API that provided all the data on the city. And let's say you were building an application that surveyed a bunch of different cities and did a bunch of cool things like built travel guides and all kinds of fun stuff like that. So how could you do that? Well, one way is to collect the data on your own, and that's really a slow and tedious process. The ideal way is that the government and state levels will provide APIs on the information that they need, and it's all standardized. So you can actually go, say something in your code like government.country or government.cities .all.each, iterate through all the cities and give me all of their data, right? Like literally it should be that easy in the future. And the time that I spent in government was actually focused on trying to think of ways that we could do stuff like that, where we can implement these APIs on a state level, on a government-wide level, and how we can utilize those. We actually had somebody who's known as the API evangelist. If you go to apievangelist.com or just Google API evangelist, Ken is fantastic. And he was actually one of the people that was in the White House with us, sort of working through those issues. And this is a big thing. I mean, it's not something to take lightly. It is something that people write off because it seems really simple. It seems like it's already done. This concept of APIs and API to API communication and all of this. There's a underlying factor in a lot of communities that there needs to be more sort of development around APIs in general. And so far what I'm doing is I'm just trying to provide you context on APIs before we dive into the Rails part. And that's how I've structured all of these so far, just giving you context and then diving in. So to continue with that, I think the challenge is not so much creating APIs. The challenge is creating standardized APIs. That's one challenge. Another challenge is understanding how to utilize those APIs. That's another challenge. Then you have sort of a communication issue. You have like a communication and a documentation type issue. Then you do have the problem of just creating them. You have that is an issue. Like, so you have all these different facets and they're all problematic in a sense. I mean, APIs aren't fully in their heyday yet. I mean, it seems as though they might be. You have a lot of services like If This Then That, Zapier, and other services like that, where they allow this communication from one thing to another thing. And it seems as though we're in the heyday of APIs. We're very far from it. We're about to enter this sort of new paradigm of the Internet of Things. And that was another thing that we were focused on as well, is like this Internet of Things where your fridge is communicating with your phone. And it's all of these standardized communication interfaces. They have to be done at an API level, and they have to be standardized, and they have to be done right. And it's absolutely critical. What you're doing when you build an Internet of Things, you're essentially building a huge node graph. Like you're building a huge graph structure, and all of these things connect to all of these other things, and how they connect, what kind of things wrap those connections. So if the API is able to send data from one thing to another, so like let's say your fridge communicates with your toaster. So let's say your toaster, no, actually, to make this a little bit more ridiculous, but actually this is literally probably going to be the future. Let's say your bread bag has an RFID tag on it, or something that allows it to be aware of its contents. Then you take your last slice of bread and you put it in the toaster. The bread bag should be able to communicate via an API. It should be able to send a little packet of JSON out to your fridge, and the fridge should be able to ingest that JSON and say, oh, I have a message from the bread bag that says I'm out of bread. And the fridge should be able to then communicate to the grocery store, to like this service that does grocery delivery or something like that, that, hey, this person needs bread. Then the fridge should analyze sort of like, does it have space for bread? Is there still space available? If so, we're okay. If not, maybe we prompt the user to do like a little cleaning. Otherwise, proceed to get the bread, purchase it using the card on file, and then deliver the bread the next day. It shows up on the doorstep. How amazing is that? And that is like a really contrived and ridiculous example of the bread bag, but that's not too far off from what hundreds of people are working on right now. So for instance, one of the guys that actually worked on the original ARPANET and worked at the Pentagon to sort of roll out their worldwide data cable network based on the US cable technology back in the day. And also he worked on Solaris's kernel and TCP/IP implementations and utilities in Solaris. And he's done tons of amazing things. He's actually working at the National Institute of Standards and Technology right now, NIST, and he's working on the Internet of Things. So how can they build this? How can they roll out sort of this worldwide protocol that's standardized and able to be implemented in anything at scale? That is an interesting thing, and that's happening right now. And how does that relate to Rails? So that is the future. And if that's the future, what that means is that APIs are incredibly important. And if APIs are incredibly important, it should be very easy to make APIs. And it's currently sometimes not. Sometimes it's challenging, perhaps there's technical limitations, data limitations. Again, it's even tough to document these things sometimes. So how do you do all of that at once? That probably won't be solved for a while. There's some things that you can utilize, like services that do auto documentation and stuff, but what Rails is doing is they're trying to make it super easy for you to spin up an API almost like arbitrarily. So let's say, for instance, you boot up your Rails application. What's happening is you're actually booting up the entire Rails middleware stack. So there's a lot of things that are starting there. And there's a lot of services that you're using. Think about all the different modules that are in Rails: Action Support, Action Mailer, Action Controller, Action Model. These are all services that Rails implements, and sometimes you need them, but sometimes you don't, right? So what we're doing here is we're trying to provide a really easy way to build a lightweight, skinny API in Rails. And utilizing Rails API, that's exactly how they do it. And that was the next thing that they discussed at the conference, was the concept of, quote, Rails API, unquote. And that is actually what it's called. And what it is it's going to be a gem, or perhaps it's going to be included in a config file, but all it does is it allows you to build these APIs without booting up all of this Rails middleware. Imagine being able to run like really thin and light and not need to spin up all of this middleware every time a request comes in. So it's not so much that when you start the server, all of this middleware boots up and then it never happens again. That's not how this works. What happens is when you make a request to an endpoint on a server, it will route it. So it routes it through Action Router or some of the routing paradigms, and then it will probably go to Action Controller. It will do a bunch of other things as well. And what's happening here is we're trying to strip out as much of that as possible. So we're saying, we don't need Action Model, maybe. Like we don't need Action Mailer. We don't need all of these other things. Like we're trying to take everything we can out of the lifeboat and just only serve the minimal utilities and modules that are necessary to send that data. And this becomes really important because what we have here is we have the speed of communication. So if APIs are going to be the future, it should be as seamless as you and me communicating in real life for them to communicate. So the only way in which this API-driven future can exist is with very little to almost no latency. And how do you get this low of latency? Well, you focus on the hardware, but you also focus on the software in the server. You have to create server software to run these APIs that is very thin and lightweight so that they can communicate effortlessly. This is the first step in that direction with Rails. So this is very important and it's very cool. So if you're thinking about exploring APIs, maybe you have a cool idea on some data that you would like to provide, then by all means, build an API and use Rails API to do it. I think Rails API is on master if you pull master edge, or at least edge. I know it's on edge. So if you get edge Rails, you'll have it. And what's cool there is, let's say you wanted to scrape a website and put the data in your database and then expose that data via JSON to some endpoint for somebody else. You can totally do that now, and I would totally recommend experimenting with that with Rails API. It'll get you familiar with Rails more. It'll get you familiar with API paradigms, and perhaps you'll read the APIevangelist.com, or you'll read how to build APIs that are really cool. Maybe you'll read a little bit about REST. Maybe you'll read a little bit about SOAP. These are types of API structures and paradigms, and CRUD paradigms as well. And maybe you will actually really enjoy doing that. I think a lot of people that don't do a lot of API work could really benefit from doing heavy API work for some brief period of time, because even if you're working on the front end, let's say you're a front-end developer, what you're probably going to be doing a lot is communicating with APIs. You're probably going to be making Ajax requests, getting data back. Every time you do that, you're communicating with an API. And it's very beneficial to understand those APIs. So building one from scratch just for a fun weekend project is really cool. And maybe you build a nice little front end so that you can make a request to your own API and sort of see what it's like, right? You look at the stats and sort of analyze what is it doing when it gets the API request, and how is the server interpreting that using Rails API? Maybe you can even time it. So you build an application with Rails doing the same thing, and you build the Rails API version, and you see how fast one is versus the other. It'll be magnitudes of difference, especially on a millisecond scale, magnitudes of difference. And also you have to keep in mind is this future of decoupling the server from the client. So as we move into this SPA future that we've been sort of ruminating on this entire episode, what we're going to eventually get to is a place where the server and the client are completely disconnected. And what that means is every server will have an API unless it's a worker. So unless it's a server that just does work, it will probably have an API so that it can communicate to some kind of client somewhere. And this is going to be the future. So you need to sort of understand these paradigms. You don't necessarily have to stop the way that you're building things now if you're doing HTML rendered web pages and switch over to this complex API server backend front end sort of system. I don't necessarily think it's something where you need to hit the brakes and move in this direction now. But I would say definitely be aware that you're going to go this way. I think we're all going to go this way eventually, especially if you're working on any non-trivial application, right? And, I think we're going to go through a period of setbacks here soon. I think we're going to go through a period where, and to an extent, we've already started this period where there was a lot of amazing talk about SPA and everybody was doing it, and then it dipped down. And there's a lot of complexity in SPA, a whole lot of complexity that gets added. So everybody realized that, almost at the same time. And then it dipped down a little bit because a lot of people were like, hey, you know what? I'm going to be a little intelligent here and I don't need necessarily all of the complexity of SPA. And now we're sort of in this realistic phase of the wave form, right? Where everybody's being very pragmatic and very realistic. It's going to be complex if we add it, so we have to be very thoughtful. Are we working on an application that needs it? And all of these questions are being asked a lot right now. Whereas if you've rewinded the tape about 24 months ago, nobody was asking that at all. Everybody was just throwing it into their projects because it was the fun thing to do. So you have to understand that we're going through a little bit of a realism and pragmatic phase right now in the SPA world. So all of these sort of things like the APIs, the ActionCable, WebSockets implementation, the sort of Turbolinks stuff, and just the Backbone JS, the Angular JS, all of these frameworks and technologies and and ideas that help us build quicker into this future, they're going to get some pushback. And you're going to see some people that are definitely not on board, some people that are, etc. But I really don't see a future where these aren't the primary means of building non-trivial web applications. And I would love to hear your feedback on that, or like to challenge me on that, because I've done some significant amount of thought on that. And I just can't imagine a future where you don't have that type of technology in place. It just doesn't make sense. Maybe if browsers changed the way that they render HTML, that could do it. If every browser changed at the same time to sort of modify how they render server-side HTML in some kind of really fancy way without using Java, I don't know, you could get weird with it if you're thinking in that direction, but I don't think that's going to happen, to be honest. That's not going to happen. Let's just pretend that won't. And I would recommend you definitely start at least reading about, again, you don't have to jump into it too early, but like I would just start reading about all of the SPA stuff, all of the single page application frameworks in JavaScript, all of the Rails 5 stuff that we've just talked about, right? All of this stuff relates to SPA. And you know, I would also caution you away from the buzzwords. So 24 months ago, 12 months ago, 18 months ago, this was a very buzzwordy topic, SPA, right? It was huge in the industry, and it still is to an extent. But again, I think we're in a sort of a pragmatic or realism phase, so it's less sort of strewn about with fandom. But I would definitely caution you away from just sort of utilizing these words without understanding what they mean. So SPA is single page application, and I would be cautious about the blog articles that you read and everything that you read. I would definitely take it all with a grain of salt and read all of the opinions and then solidify your own, right? Nobody really knows where we're going in the future. And if you're trying to invest in Rails, it's tough because you're saying to yourself, I'm investing in something I know that's going to have legs. And if you're investing in SPA, you're saying to yourself, I know SPA has legs. So yeah, I get that it's tough to actually make a decision on this because it adds significant complexity to a project. So I totally get why a lot of people, write me saying it's challenging to learn these JavaScript frameworks and how do we do it, or how do we even go about it? I totally get that. So I just think the Rails ideas are interesting. Explore those. Maybe all of this is going to be automated in the next couple of years, and if so, that's awesome. Nobody has these concerns anymore, right? So anyway, that's all I have to say about Rails 5 and SPA and the future of SPA and all of my thoughts around that topic. Rails 5 has definitely been heavy on the automation of front-end paradigms, and it's something that's really cool to see. And I'm really stoked that the core team is just really sort of, they're disagreeing with each other, but they're doing it in the most respectful way. They're just a great example of how communities can interact. And to wrap this up, what I want to do is touch on two more things, and then we'll close the show. I know it's gone on kind of long and a bit of rambling, but I hope I gave you context on everything that I discussed so that you now understand a little bit more about these terms and a little bit more about the industry around them. So the two things I want to touch on are what Aaron Patterson is working on, and then I want to touch on other Ruby frameworks and just quickly highlight one, and that's it. So the first thing is Aaron Patterson is a Ruby core member and a Rails core team member, and he is a brilliant guy. He's very much a sort of down in the memory type developer where he focuses a lot on what is this unit of work doing? What is this algorithm doing? He's very computer science heavy, whereas DHH tends to be more literary in his development. He almost wants things to be read like a human would read them, whereas Aaron is more of a technical computer science, like he wants it to be optimally performing. And I think both have values and virtues, so we'll discuss that perhaps. But Aaron is working on some cool stuff. So some of the things Aaron's working on, you can also watch this on his keynote talk, which he gave, I believe, the second day, first thing in the morning. And you can actually watch that on YouTube. But what he's working on is two things. So he's working on automatic parallel testing and faster testing in general. So what he's trying to do is some interesting things where we remove certain test frameworks. So for instance, he realized that the controller testing framework is very similar to the integration testing framework. And what he would like to do is sort of back out the code from the controller testing framework and shim it with the integration tests. So if you write controller test code in test unit or whatever, then the implementation of that under the hood is going to be just the integration test framework. And what that does is it removes perhaps hundreds of lines of code and further reducing technical debt. And that's something that Aaron's been focused on a lot, is reducing technical debt and just trying to figure out ways to do optimizations. So previously, if you've been following Rails, you know the previous Rails version had something called adequate record, which was Aaron's 3-year project to speed up active record queries using one very specific type of SQL generation. By utilizing sort of a cached string, he was able to speed up certain queries by a factor of over 100%. And it's actually really a no-brainer type of implementation. It was excellent talk. He also gave a Railsconf talk on that. And at the end of the Railsconf talk last year, or in 2014, whatever it was that this was announced, he merged adequate record into Rails live on stage. So at the end of the talk. So definitely go check that out. Very cool moment in Rails history there. It's not super important probably in the grand scheme of things, but it was just fun to see the merging live on stage. I thought that was neat. So he's working on replacing the controller test with the integration test, and he's also working on automatic parallel testing. So what this would do is it would essentially speed up all of the tests that you write. And this is sort of another important topic, and I'm not going to go into this too much, but as we move into this future that we've been talking about the whole episode, where things are more complicated, you could probably see how this type of Internet of Things future is complicated, right? Like there's devices talking to each other. You're expecting that programs behave independently of human intervention. You're expecting that they continue to behave, even though we have things like bit rot and just like these issues that go on with technical debt and bugs that form from complex data. So how do we solve this? How do we get all of these complex things to communicate with each other and in complex and non-trivial ways and maintain that in the future? Well, one way is with testing, right? So we write tests for our code. We write unit tests, controller tests, integration tests, feature tests, whatever we need. We don't, I'm not religious about any one of them, but I write whatever is necessary. And as an industry, we try to write them so that we harden ourselves and we defensively stop bugs from appearing in the future. So, there's a lot of issues around testing where people sometimes don't test the right things and blah, blah, blah. There is a lot of issues, but the point is testing becomes an indispensable piece of this future where complex things are present. There needs to be something that tests the negative space. There needs to be something that tests the existence of it, the positive space. Like there needs to be many, many types of tests, and having those there makes us all feel more confident, makes us all feel more secure. As far as like eventually in the future using contracts from one thing to communicate to another thing autonomously without any human intervention, then yeah, there better be a ton of testing around that, because if a machine is contracted to communicate with another machine and those two are supposed to form some kind of consensus-based agreement, then not only is the algorithm have to be well defined, but the testing of the data coming in and out in the edge cases and what the algorithm should do in every single one of those cases should be defined and tested. And that's sort of the concept behind why tests need to be faster. So if we write faster tests, we can move into that future quicker. So we can just run right into that future. If tests are like as fast as, a second or 2 seconds, then we're well on our way to keep writing them. We need developers to continue writing tests, and developers have to love writing tests. And currently, sometimes developers hate it, because if you come onto a huge Rails app or huge project in Java running JRuby or just any kind of project, .NET project with thousands of tests and you run the tests, it sometimes can take 30 minutes, right? Like I've seen production testing environments take 30 minutes plus, even with some parallelism. So what we're getting at is this issue where testing is too long, people don't want to do it, and that is leading to this negative, it's an anti-pattern. We're leading into this negative trait just by the technology not being good enough. And that is what drives Aaron, I think, to work on this. And he touched on this a little bit in his keynote, but we all really believe in tests. And you should too. I mean, I think they've been proven, and the concept of testing things like proofs in mathematics have been proven for thousands of years, right? And testing has been proven to be helpful since the 90s and perhaps even since the, I guess you couldn't test punch cards, but I don't know, maybe you could. But, you know, it's something that IBM has used, Solaris and Linux implementations have used. It's something that is widely accepted as being good, and it's making its way more and more into the web world. And the web world really highlighted it for a lot of developers. I know tons of developers that have never done C++ testing or game development testing or kernel testing or OS testing, but they've tested in the web. And that's awesome. Like, we need more people to be all about testing. And that's sort of the point of this again. So Aaron's focus is faster testing, more people that are happy doing it. More people that are happy doing it means we can quickly arrive in a future where we have tons of tests and everything is secure. And that is a great place to be, I think. Anyway, that's all you need to know about that. And the last thing I want to touch on is other frameworks in Ruby. There's a framework called Volt. Check it out. I'll have a link in the show notes at starthere.fm/rubyonrails/2. TWO spelt out 2. And what that link will be is just to another framework. It's very similar to Rails. I think, you know, this episode we've talked a lot about like the next couple of years. I think in the next couple of years, we'll see a lot more of these frameworks come out that are similar to Rails, but different in some way. There's a lot of intelligent people working in the community, and you can't expect all of those people to work in one framework. And also, you're going to start seeing Ruby used a lot more in other areas. So Ruby as a scientific language, such as Python, with the Python libraries that made Python such a powerful scientific language, Ruby is seeing that as well. There's robots being programmed in Ruby. There's games being programmed in Ruby. There's a bunch of really fun, cool, like non-web stuff that's going on in Ruby right now. And also, there's a bunch of cool web frameworks that are being programmed in Ruby that are very similar to Rails, but also, you know, some of them have integrations with like some kind of SPA thinking, right? Like, so imagine you built a framework today. You would probably build it such that you could integrate some kind of SPA architecture really easily, because if that's the future, that's what you want to do. So there's like Volt does this, where if you go look at the Volt website and the video there, there's a bunch of cool things going on. And I think it's interesting, and I think it's worth checking out. So I just wanted to throw that out there and hope you guys like it. And if you don't, that's cool too. And I definitely don't recommend switching over. I would say play with it, but, you know, as far as like production tested Ruby frameworks, I don't know of any I've used ever that other than Rails that have served massive amounts of traffic. I mean, some Sinatra stuff can be done that way. Sinatra is just a lightweight Ruby framework. So again, similar to Rails, but very lightweight. And you have a bunch of these really cool lightweight frameworks coming out as well. So it's a cool time to get into Ruby as a whole. I think it's really exciting. And I think, you know, I'm glad that you guys are getting into it and listening to this podcast. It just means that, you know, we're all sort of here together, and we're all definitely working towards trying to make Ruby better, make Rails better, and make any frameworks better. And the experience for people coming into the industry and this language and frameworks and all of this stuff, we want to make that better, right? And that's what hopefully this podcast does, and it makes your life a little bit easier to understand everything that's going on without necessarily having to read all about it on a bunch of different blogs. But if you are interested in reading all of the things that I just referenced, I will have links so you can jump around to all those items in the show notes. Again, at starthere.fm/rubyonrails spelt out /2, TWO, the word 2. And again, feel free to rate us on iTunes. I love doing these shows. In the next episode, we're going to be back into our educational material after you got the context of the industry here today. I'm hoping to do these once a week. It's been a little bit rough with my schedule lately because the last week was so slammed packed, but definitely next week I want to get that educational episode that we're working on out there for you guys so you can continue your education. But in the meantime, I would still recommend, at least 3 weeks on tutorials, videos, reading, before you jump into actually building your own thing. And again, it's only been 2 weeks, so you still have one more week where you can focus on that. And I think if you've been doing it, awesome. Continue. And we'll touch back again within a couple weeks, and we will see what the next steps are. Cool, guys. Thanks a lot for listening.